For 31 years, Eleanor Bennett let her 3 children believe she barely had enough to get by. She didn't. She had $12 million, and she never told a single one of them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her daughter Peggy drove 2 hours every week to take her to doctor's appointments, certain her mother couldn't afford to hire help. Her son Richard left $20 bills on her kitchen table before he walked out the door, the way you'd leave a tip for someone you didn't expect to see again. None of them ever asked how she managed on so little, because none of them ever imagined there was anything to ask. 6 days after her funeral, all 3 of her children sat in a small law office and watched a stranger open a folder that would undo everything they thought they understood about the woman who raised them. For 31 years, Eleanor Nell Bennett wore the same brown wool coat every winter, the one with the frayed cuff she refused to replace. Her daughter Peggy used to joke that their mother clipped coupons the way other women collected jewelry, carefully, patiently, like each one meant something. Nobody in that family ever asked Nell how she managed on so little. They simply assumed she didn't have more to give. On the morning she was laid to rest, none of them knew they were about to learn just how wrong they had been. 6 days after the funeral, all 3 of her children sat inside a small law office on the edge of town, in wooden chairs that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. Susan, the youngest, hadn't spoken to her mother in over 6 years, and she stared at the floor the entire time, unable to look at her siblings. Richard kept checking his watch, certain this would take 10 minutes at most. Peggy sat closest to the desk, the way she always had, the one who stayed, the one who drove Nell to every doctor's appointment for the last decade while her brother and sister built lives 2 states away. None of them expected the man across the desk to open a folder that would undo everything they thought they understood about their mother. The attorney, a quiet man named Alan Pierce who had known Nell for nearly 30 years, cleared his throat before he spoke. He told them their mother had asked him to keep something from all 3 of them, something she had built slowly, secretly, one decision at a time, starting long before any of them were born into the families they had now. He placed a sealed envelope on the desk, along with a set of documents none of them recognized, including a deed to a second property that had never once come up in 30 years of holidays, birthdays, and Sunday phone calls. Richard's jaw tightened. Susan finally looked up. Peggy's hands went still in her lap for the first time all week. What Alan Pierce read to them next would change the way all 3 of Nell's children understood their entire childhood, their father, and the woman they had spent decades quietly underestimating. Because Eleanor Nell Bennett had not been poor, she had been waiting to see who her children would become before she ever let them know what she truly had. And by the time that envelope was fully open, one figure on that page would leave the entire room in complete silence. $12 million, sitting quietly behind a woman nobody ever thought to ask twice. To understand how a woman could hide $12 million from her own children for 3 decades, you first have to understand who Eleanor Bennett appeared to be, because almost none of it was the full picture. She was the woman who reused tinfoil until it tore, who drove a car with over 200,000 miles on it, who spent every Sunday afternoon at the same small church 3 blocks from her house. Her children loved her, but they had also, without ever quite admitting it, stopped being curious about her. It is a strange thing that happens in families. The people who raise us eventually become so familiar that we stop asking questions about them, and it was inside that silence that Nell built an entire second life. 3 questions sat unanswered in that lawyer's office, and they would not leave any of the Bennett children alone for the rest of that year. Where had the money actually come from? A woman who worked part-time at a fabric shop for 20 years, married to a man who spent his life on a factory floor, does not simply accumulate a fortune of that size by accident. Something had been built, quietly, deliberately, and none of her children had been allowed to see it happen. The second question was harder to sit with. Why would a mother hide something like this from the people she loved most? And the third question, the one that would keep Richard awake that night, staring at the ceiling of a house he barely visited, who exactly had she chosen to leave it to, and why? There was a fourth question too, one none of them said out loud that first day, though each of them carried it quietly for weeks afterward. What else had she been protecting them from, and had they somehow failed to notice her doing it? Because as Alan Pierce would soon make clear, the will did not split things evenly. And in families, uneven inheritance rarely stays quiet for long. Somewhere beneath the surface of this ordinary, unremarkable family, a woman had spent 30 years making decisions none of her children ever knew were being made on their behalf. To really understand what happened in that office, we have to go back further, long before Alan Pierce ever opened that folder. back to the small house on Larkspur Lane where Nell Bennett had lived for over 40 years. She kept the same faded curtains in the kitchen window for as long as anyone could remember. Every Saturday, without fail, she baked something small for the church sale, usually lemon bars. And every Saturday, without fail, someone in the family would gently tease her about needing to save her money instead of giving it away. She would just smile and say she had everything she needed. Nobody thought to ask what that actually meant. The people at her small church knew her as a fixture rather than a mystery. She sat in the same pew every Sunday, third row from the back, on the aisle side, and she never once missed a service, unless illness kept her home. She volunteered at the food pantry on Wednesday mornings, sorting canned goods with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else in her life. The pastor once mentioned at her funeral that Nell had donated to the building fund every single year for 3 decades, modest amounts, never more than she could easily spare, or so everyone assumed. Nobody in that congregation, not even the pastor who knew her best, had any idea how much she was actually capable of giving. Her husband, Walter Bennett, had died 15 years earlier, and the family had always understood him the same simple way they understood Nell. A factory foreman, a quiet man who worked long shifts and came home smelling of machine oil, who rarely spoke about his job beyond complaining about the noise or the cold mornings. He had a particular way of sitting at the kitchen table each evening, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading the newspaper cover to cover before saying much of anything to anyone. His children remembered him as steady, unremarkable, a man who worked hard and expected little in return. There was one photograph, though, tucked into the back of a family album that never quite made sense. Walter in a tailored suit, standing outside a downtown office building none of his children recognized, dated years before any of them were born. Peggy had asked about it once as a teenager, running her finger along the edge of the photograph. Nell had simply closed the album and said it was from before she knew him well. Nobody pressed further. Families rarely do. What the Bennett children knew of their parents' marriage was built almost entirely on assumption. They assumed their father's paycheck barely covered the mortgage. They assumed their mother's frugality came from necessity, not choice. They assumed the modest house, the aging car, and the second-hand furniture told the whole story of who their parents had been. Every birthday growing up had followed the same pattern, one modest gift, always practical, always something needed rather than wanted, and every year the children quietly understood without being told that asking for more simply wasn't an option in their household. In truth, those assumptions were exactly what Nell and Walter had spent decades quietly encouraging, though not one of their children understood why. Not yet. The sibling relationships themselves had their own long, complicated history. Peggy, the eldest, had become her mother's default caretaker almost without anyone deciding it that way. She was the one who called every Sunday, who noticed when Nell's medication needed refilling, who drove 2 hours each way whenever there was a doctor's appointment that couldn't be avoided. There had been a particularly difficult winter, 3 years earlier, when Nell's blood pressure medication needed adjusting twice in a single month, and it was Peggy who took time off work without complaint. Peggy who sat in waiting rooms reading old magazines while her siblings sent occasional text messages asking how things were going. She had built a quiet resentment over the years, not toward her mother, but toward her siblings, who always seemed to have somewhere more important to be. Richard, the middle child, had built a comfortable life 2 states away, and visited twice a year with a rehearsed kind of warmth that never quite settled into anything real. His visits followed a familiar rhythm, arriving with an expensive bottle of wine Nell never opened, staying just long enough to seem present, leaving before any real conversation could take root. His wife, Diane, had never been close to Nell, and had long made her opinions known about how the family's finances ought to be handled, though nobody had ever taken those opinions especially seriously, at least not yet. Diane often remarked, usually within earshot of Richard alone, that Nell's insistence on driving that old car or refusing help with home repairs bordered on stubbornness rather than genuine necessity, never quite considering that stubbornness and secrecy might be 2 very different things. Susan, the youngest, carried the heaviest silence of all 3. 6 years earlier, a difficult conversation about her divorce had ended with words neither she nor her mother ever fully took back. It had happened at a Thanksgiving dinner, Nell making an offhand comment about commitment that Susan heard as judgment rather than concern, and within minutes the argument had escalated into something neither woman knew how to walk back from. Susan had stopped visiting, stopped calling. The estrangement had become so normal that the family had almost stopped mentioning her name at Sunday dinners, as though the silence itself had become a kind of agreement. Nell never spoke badly of her youngest daughter, not once, not even when Peggy, in frustration, brought up how unfair the distance felt. She would only ever say the same quiet sentence, Give her time, she'll come back when she's ready. Then there was Tommy, Peggy's son, the one grandchild who never seemed to need anything explained to him. He fixed the loose step on Nell's porch without being asked. He brought her the newspaper every Thursday, sat with her for an hour even when neither of them said much, and never once mentioned the modest house or the old car, because to Tommy none of that mattered. He worked most weekends repairing antique clocks and watches out of a small rented corner of a shop downtown, a quiet trade he loved but one that barely covered his bills. He dreamed someday of opening a small restoration shop of his own, though he rarely said it out loud, afraid it sounded foolish. Nell listened to that dream more closely than anyone realized. She once asked him, casually over coffee, exactly how much a small storefront downtown might cost to lease, and how much equipment a shop like that would need starting out. Tommy answered without thinking much of it, assuming it was simply his grandmother making conversation. It wasn't, and then there was Rosa Delgado, Nell's neighbor for nearly 20 years, the only person outside the family who seemed to see Nell clearly. Rosa would sit with her on the porch some evenings, the two of them talking quietly while the rest of the street settled into darkness. It was Rosa who noticed the envelope Nell mailed out faithfully on the first of every month, addressed to a name none of the family would have recognized. When Rosa once asked about it, gently, Nell only said, "They'll understand someday, just not yet." Rosa never asked again, but she never forgot the way Nell's hands trembled slightly whenever she sealed that envelope, as though the weight of 30 years of silence lived inside it. Rosa also remembered something else, something she would only mention much later. Nell kept a second, smaller ledger in her kitchen drawer, separate from her regular checkbook, filled with careful handwriting and numbers that never seemed to match the modest life she led. Rosa had glimpsed it once, by accident, and never mentioned it again until it mattered. There was one more piece of Nell's life that none of her children ever thought to examine closely, and that was how she spent her afternoons. 3 times a week, she took the same slow walk to the public library downtown, always carrying the same canvas tote bag, always returning 2 hours later with a stack of books tucked beneath her arm. Her children assumed she simply enjoyed reading, and she did, but the librarians who knew her best remembered something else entirely, a woman who spent long afternoons in the small reference room near the back, reading financial publications and market reports with the same quiet focus she brought to everything else in her life. One librarian, a woman named Carol who had worked there for over a decade, once mentioned to Nell how unusual it was to see someone her age so engaged with that kind of material. Nell had simply smiled and said she liked to stay informed, and Carol never thought much more of it, filing it away as one of those small, harmless eccentricities that make people interesting. Nell also kept a small notebook in her purse, one she carried everywhere, filled with handwriting so careful it looked almost printed. Rosa had seen her writing in it dozens of times over the years, on the porch, at the kitchen table, once even at church while waiting for the service to begin. She always assumed it was a journal, the kind of thing older women often keep, filled with small daily observations and memories worth holding on to. She never asked to see inside it, and Nell never offered, and it would be months after her passing before anyone in the family understood exactly what that notebook actually contained. Page after page of careful financial notes spanning back further than any of them could have imagined. None of the Bennett children knew any of this. Not the envelopes, not the photograph, not the ledger in the kitchen drawer, not the library visits or the notebook in her purse, not the quiet financial decisions being made behind closed doors for 3 decades. All they knew was the woman in the brown wool coat, clipping coupons, baking lemon bars, asking for nothing. It would take one final, ordinary Tuesday morning for everything they thought they understood about her to begin quietly, irreversibly coming apart. It was Rosa who found her. An ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that had repeated itself thousands of times on Larkspur Lane, except this time Nell didn't answer when Rosa knocked to return a borrowed casserole dish. Rosa knocked twice more, called through the screen door, and when no answer came, let herself in using the spare key Nell had given her years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, though neither woman had ever said as much out loud. She found Nell on the kitchen floor, still breathing, and the next several minutes passed in the kind of blur that only comes with real fear, a call to emergency services, Rosa's own hands shaking as she waited for the ambulance to arrive. The ambulance reached the hospital within minutes, but by the time the family gathered in the waiting room, the doctors had already delivered the kind of news no amount of preparation ever softens. Nell Bennett had suffered a massive stroke in her sleep. She was still alive, but barely, and the family was told to prepare for the worst. Peggy arrived first, having been closest, still in the clothes she'd been wearing when the call came through. Richard flew in that same evening, Diane beside him, already asking hospital staff quiet, practical questions about paperwork and next steps that nobody in the family had the energy to answer. Susan received the call from a cousin, someone who still had her number after all these years, and drove through the night without stopping, arriving sometime after 2 in the morning. Those final days, the old tensions surfaced even inside the sterile hospital room, the way they always seem to during a crisis. Richard spent most of his time on his phone in the hallway, handling calls he insisted couldn't wait, though Peggy noticed, without saying anything, that most of those calls seemed to last far longer than any business call reasonably should. Diane made quiet comments about hospital costs and paperwork that nobody wanted to hear, at one point asking a nurse, within earshot of the family, whether the hospital offered any kind of payment plan, as though the family's finances were suddenly hers to manage. Peggy sat exhausted in the corner chair she had claimed on the first night, refusing to leave even to sleep, running on vending machine coffee and the same quiet determination that had carried her through a decade of caretaking. And then, unexpectedly, Susan walked through the door on the second day, having driven 6 hours after hearing the news from a cousin. Nobody said much to her, nobody needed to. Her presence alone said more than 6 years of silence ever could. On the final evening, when most of the family had stepped out for coffee, Tommy sat alone with his grandmother, holding her hand the way he had 100 times before. The room was quiet except for the steady, mechanical rhythm of the machines beside her bed. Her eyes opened briefly, and though her voice was barely above a whisper, she managed to say something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Everything you need to know is already yours. You just haven't looked yet." He assumed, in the moment, it was simply the confusion that often comes at the end. He squeezed her hand and told her to rest, that everything was going to be all right. The way we all do in moments like that, needing to believe it more than actually believing it. He would understand, weeks later, exactly how wrong that assumption was. Nell passed peacefully just after midnight, surrounded by machines rather than family, since everyone had briefly stepped away for coffee they never finished drinking. The guilt of that timing would sit with each of them differently in the weeks that followed, though none of them spoke of it directly. The funeral that followed was small, exactly as she would have wanted it, held at the same small church where she'd sat in the same pew for 30 years. Even there, old patterns quietly resurfaced. Diane made a passing comment about the modest choice of casket, loud enough for Peggy to hear from 2 rows away. Richard stood slightly apart from his sisters, unsure how close he was allowed to stand after years of distance, shifting his weight from one foot to the other throughout most of the service. Peggy accepted condolences on autopilot, too exhausted from a decade of caretaking to fully process her own grief, offering the same practiced smile to every well-wisher who approached her. And Susan stood at the edge of the gathering, tears falling freely, grieving not only her mother but the 6 years she could never get back, the conversations she would never have the chance to finish. In the days after the funeral, the family began the slow, uncomfortable work of sorting through Nell's house, the kind of task that forces relatives to confront both grief and each other in equal measure. It was Peggy who found the strongbox first, tucked deep in the back of Nell's closet, behind a row of winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. Locked, heavier than it had any right to be for a woman who supposedly had so little. She lifted it carefully, testing its weight, running her fingers over the small combination lock built into its lid. She assumed reasonably that it held cash, savings Nell had quietly set aside over the years, maybe enough for a modest inheritance to split 3 ways. Enough to explain the weight without explaining much else. She said nothing to her siblings yet, wanting to understand what she was looking at before starting a conversation the family wasn't ready for. Then Tommy found the key. A small brass key, tucked inside an old sewing tin at the bottom of Nell's dresser drawer, unlike anything that matched a single lock in the house. He turned it over in his palm more than once, studying the small worn numbers stamped into its side, numbers that meant nothing to him yet. He asked Rosa about it, almost in passing, catching her on the porch one evening while helping carry boxes to his car. He watched her expression shift into something careful, something deliberately unreadable, the kind of look that told him she knew far more than she was willing to say. "That's not mine to explain," she told him gently, setting down the box she'd been holding. "Ask the lawyer, not me." It was the first moment any of the Bennett family understood that someone outside their circle knew more about Nell than they did, and it left Tommy with more questions than he'd walked onto that porch carrying. Tucked inside Nell's Bible, alongside old church bulletins and a pressed flower nobody could identify, was a business card for a lawyer named Alan Pierce. The paper soft and slightly yellowed with age. The family assumed it was routine, standard paperwork every person accumulates by the end of a long life. The kind of thing tucked away and forgotten until it's needed. They scheduled the meeting expecting a brief, uneventful formality. A will splitting a modest estate three ways: signatures, condolences, and a quiet drive home afterward. None of them were prepared for what happened when they sat down across from him 5 days later, in an office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and Alan Pierce opened the folder in front of him with a heaviness in his hands that made the room go still before he even said a word. "Before I read this," he told them quietly, folding his hands over the folder, "I need you to understand something. Your mother asked me to keep something from you. For 30 years, what followed over the next several weeks felt less like settling an estate and more like slowly assembling a puzzle none of the Bennett children had known they were part of." Alan Pierce explained carefully that their mother had not been living off a modest fixed income at all. Beginning in the early 1990s, she had quietly built a diversified financial portfolio, managed with the same discipline she brought to every coupon and every Sunday church offering. He slid a stack of statements across the desk, decades of them, each one showing slow, steady, deliberate growth, the kind that comes not from luck but from patience exercised over an entire lifetime. The frugality the family had spent decades quietly pitying wasn't a symptom of poverty. It had been the exact opposite. It had been the engine. Richard predictably reached for the darkest explanation first. If their mother had been hiding money for 30 years, he reasoned aloud in front of the others, leaning forward in his chair, there had to be something shameful behind it. A secret debt, a second family somewhere, something worth burying, worth 30 years of careful silence to keep buried. Diane quietly encouraged the theory more than she probably should have, suggesting the envelopes Nell mailed out every month for years might have been paying off some kind of long-hidden obligation, her voice edged with the particular certainty of someone who has already decided what they believe. For a few uncomfortable days, that assumption sat over the family like a low, uneasy fog, coloring every memory of Nell with new suspicion, every kindness suddenly re-examined for some hidden motive. Peggy, for her part, refused to entertain the theory as quickly as her brother had, though she couldn't entirely shake her own private doubts either. She spent one particularly restless night going through old photo albums, searching every image for some clue she might have missed over the years, some detail that would explain what her mother had been hiding and why. She found nothing conclusive, only the same familiar photographs of birthdays and holidays that had always told the story she thought she knew. Susan, quieter than either of her siblings during this stretch, mostly kept to herself, though she began, for the first time in years, reaching out to Peggy with small, tentative text messages, checking in, asking how she was holding up. It was a small thing, but it was the first thread of contact either woman had allowed in 6 years. Unable to sit with the uncertainty, Tommy drove to Rosa's house one evening, needing answers his own mother hadn't been able to give him. Rosa, sitting on the same porch where she'd shared countless quiet evenings with Nell, finally offered something, choosing her words carefully, the way someone does when they've been keeping a promise for a very long time. "Ask the lawyer about the trust," she said, wrapping both hands around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. That envelope wasn't a secret to be ashamed of, it was a promise she kept every single month for 30 years. It wasn't the full answer, but it was enough to quiet the ugliest theories circling the family, and Tommy carried those words back to his mother and his aunt and uncle the following morning. When the Bennett siblings returned to Alan Pierce's office, he clarified exactly what those monthly envelopes had been. Not blackmail, not a hidden debt. A private trust, one Nell had funded faithfully every month since the early 90s, built for a purpose she had never shared with a single member of her family, not even Rosa, who had only ever known that the money existed, never why. The relief in the room was immediate, followed just as quickly by a new, sharper kind of confusion. If it wasn't shameful, why hide it at all? Why let 3 children believe for 30 years that money was something scarce in their household when it clearly hadn't been? The answer to that question led back to Walter. Alan Pierce revealed what none of the children had ever known about their father, reaching for a separate folder he'd kept set aside for exactly this part of the conversation. The simple factory foreman they remembered had, in the 1970s, co-developed a small manufacturing patent alongside a former colleague, a modest but clever improvement to industrial machine components that quietly paid royalties for decades afterward, long after Walter himself had stopped thinking of it as anything more than an old idea from his younger years. It wasn't a fortune on its own, but combined with Nell's careful decades of investing, it became the foundation of everything that followed. The photograph of Walter in the tailored suit, the one Peggy had asked about as a teenager, suddenly made sense. It hadn't been a stranger's life. It had been a life their parents had deliberately kept separate from the one they raised their children inside, folded away and never mentioned, the way you might fold away a coat you no longer need but can't quite bring yourself to throw out. For all 3 siblings, this reframed an entire childhood in a matter of minutes. Every modest Christmas, every hand-me-down sweater, every quiet refusal to replace an old coat had not been the result of hardship. It had been a choice, made together, by two people who understood something about money that they had never once explained to their own children. Richard sat back in his chair, quiet for the first time in days, thinking of every offhand joke he'd made over the years about his parents' frugality, every time he'd assumed his upbringing had simply been modest rather than deliberately constructed. Peggy thought of every doctor's appointment, every moment she'd quietly worried about her mother's finances without ever once being told there was nothing to worry about at all. Nell had managed the finances alone after Walter's death, in complete secrecy, because she fear-rooted in something none of them yet understood, something that would only become clear much later. Alan Pierce also walked the siblings through the notebook found in Nell's purse, the one Rosa had glimpsed dozens of times over the years without ever understanding what it held. Page after page documented decades of small, disciplined decisions, dividends reinvested rather than spent, modest sums moved carefully between accounts, notes to herself about which stocks to hold through difficult years and which to quietly let go. It read less like a financial record and more like a diary of restraint, 3 decades of a woman choosing patience over comfort again and again without a single soul beside her to share the weight of that decision. Peggy found herself unable to stop reading once she started, recognizing her mother's handwriting in every careful entry, understanding for the first time the sheer discipline it must have taken to maintain a lie of modesty for so long while quietly building something enormous underneath it. An hour earlier, Peggy, hurt that her mother hadn't trusted her enough to explain any of this while she was alive, a hurt that ran deeper than money ever could. Susan, silent, feeling something shift quietly beneath years of guilt, something she wasn't yet ready to name. None of them yet understood that the largest reveal of the afternoon hadn't even been spoken aloud. Alan Pierce finally turned to the will itself, and within the first sentence, every assumption the Bennett family had carried into that office quietly collapsed. The estate was not divided evenly among the 3 children, and the room's temperature seemed to shift the moment that became clear, chairs creaking as 3 siblings sat up a little straighter, bracing for whatever came next. The largest portion, a trust built specifically for a single purpose, had been set aside for Tommy. Not because he had been anyone's favorite, Alan Pierce clarified gently, watching Peggy's face carefully as he said it, but because Nell had spent years quietly funding his education without ever telling him where the money had come from, and she had long known exactly what he would do with an opportunity like this. The trust was structured specifically to help him open the small watch and clock restoration shop he had spoken about only a handful of times, always half joking, always certain it would never actually happen, a dream he'd mentioned to his grandmother over coffee more times than he'd realized she was actually listening. There was a second layer to the will that surprised the room even further. A separate portion of the estate had been set aside specifically for Susan, not as a simple inheritance, but structured deliberately to fund family counseling and a fresh financial start, the kind of resource Susan had never once asked for and certainly never expected. It wasn't a reward, Alan Pierce explained, watching Susan's hands tighten in her lap, and it certainly wasn't a punishment for the estrangement. It was in Nell's own words written into the trust documents, a bridge, something she hoped her youngest daughter would eventually choose to walk back across, in her own time, on her own terms, with no pressure attached beyond the quiet hope that she would. Richard's reaction was immediate and sharp. He questioned aloud whether the will could even be considered fair, whether it could be challenged, his voice rising in a way that surprised even Diane, who had spent weeks quietly stoking exactly this kind of suspicion and now seemed almost taken aback by how far her husband was willing to take it in front of the lawyer. "This doesn't make sense," Richard said, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. 30 years, and this is who she trusted. Alan Pierce let the silence sit for a moment before responding calmly, the way someone speaks when they've had this exact conversation before with other families in other rooms. "She trusted all 3 of you," he said, "just not in the same way and not for the same reasons." Peggy, for a moment, felt the same old wound reopen, the sense of being the responsible one who had once again been overlooked, until Alan Pierce gently indicated there was more still to explain and asked for her patience a little longer, his tone soft enough to keep her in her seat rather than walking out, which for one brief moment she had genuinely considered doing. Before addressing Peggy's portion directly, Alan Pierce reached for a sealed letter Nell had written months before her passing, asking that it be read aloud to all 3 of her children together, in this exact room, at this exact moment, a request she had apparently been very specific about. His voice softened as he read it, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room fell completely quiet, even Richard leaning forward slightly to listen. Nell had written that she wasn't hiding money out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of fear she had carried since long before any of them were born, that sudden wealth could quietly poison even the closest relationships if it arrived before people were emotionally ready to hold it. She wrote about watching this exact thing happen once before, long ago, in a family she rarely spoke of, and how she had promised herself as a very young woman that she would do everything in her power to make sure it never happened to the family she built with Walter. She wrote that she loved each of her children exactly as they were, flaws and distance and old wounds included, and that everything in the will had been designed not to reward or punish, but simply to give each of them what she believed they needed most, not what would simply be easiest to divide equally on paper. By the time Alan Pierce finished reading, the room had changed completely. Susan was openly crying, the walls she had carried for 6 years finally beginning to crack, her shoulders shaking with a kind of grief that had clearly been waiting a long time for permission to surface. Peggy reached over and took her sister's hand, something neither of them had done in years, a small, wordless gesture that said more than any conversation could have, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply sitting together the way sisters do when words would only get in the way. Even Richard grew quiet, staring at the folder in front of him, seeming for the first time all day less concerned with fairness and more with everything he hadn't understood about his own mother, his jaw loosening from the tight, defensive line it had held for most of the meeting. Diane, watching her husband's expression shift, said nothing at all for the rest of the appointment, perhaps sensing for the first time that this conversation had moved somewhere she no longer had any place in. Alan Pierce set one final envelope on the desk, separate from everything else, its edges slightly worn, as though it had been handled many times before being sealed for good. "There's one more thing," he said quietly, "something even I didn't know until last week." The room, already unsteady from everything revealed in the last hour, went completely silent once more, all three siblings staring at the small brown envelope as though it might explain everything that had come before it, or perhaps everything that was still to come. Inside the shoebox, tied with the same kitchen string Nell used every summer for her garden, sat a single faded photograph, one none of her children had ever seen before, its edges softened by decades of careful handling. A teenage Nell, no older than 16, standing in front of a grand family estate none of them recognized, wearing clothing far finer than anything they had ever seen her wear, her expression caught somewhere between pride and something closer to sadness. Alongside the photograph was a short letter, written decades ago in Nell's careful handwriting, explaining a part of her life she had chosen to leave behind long before any of her children were born, folded and refolded so many times over the years that the creases had gone soft with age. Nell had come from real wealth herself, a family fortune inherited 2 generations earlier, one that had slowly torn her own mother's siblings apart through decades of resentment, lawsuits, and silence disguised as tradition. She wrote about holidays spent in rooms full of relatives who barely spoke to one another, about an aunt and uncle who hadn't exchanged a single word in 15 years over a disagreement about property that neither of them could even fully explain anymore by the time it ended. She wrote about watching her own grandmother's estate divided among children who stopped speaking to each other the moment the ink dried on the paperwork, family gatherings that grew smaller and smaller each year until eventually they stopped happening altogether. Nell had watched money quietly destroy relationships that love alone might have survived, and at 19 years old she made a decision most people would never understand. She walked away from her family's fortune entirely, choosing instead a modest life with Walter, a man with nothing but ambition and a small idea for a patent that would take years to pay off. Her own parents had been furious, she wrote, certain she was making the mistake of her life, certain she would come crawling back within a year once the reality of a modest income set in. She never did. She and Walter married in a small ceremony with barely a dozen guests, moved into a rented apartment with second-hand furniture, and built their life from nothing, the way Nell had always secretly wanted to, free from the weight of money that had never once brought her family any real closeness. It hadn't been necessity that shaped Nell's frugal life. It had been a promise she made to herself as a teenager, that her own children would never inherit money before they were ready to hold it without losing each other in the process. A promise she had kept, quietly and completely, for the rest of her life. Alan Pierce then turned to the portion of the will set aside for Peggy, the one piece nobody had explained yet, and for the first time in the entire meeting his voice carried something closer to warmth than formality. It wasn't a percentage of the trust or a lump sum split evenly with her siblings. It was full, outright ownership of the family home on Larkspur Lane, free and clear of any debt, along with a private letter thanking Peggy specifically for the decade of quiet, unacknowledged care nobody else in the family had fully seen. The letter described specific memories Nell had kept close, the winter Peggy drove through icy roads for a medication refill, The countless Sunday phone calls Peggy never once missed even during her own hardest years. The quiet, steady presence Peggy had provided without ever once being asked to. For the first time since walking into that office, Peggy allowed herself to cry openly. Decades of quiet resentment finally softened by the simple fact of being truly seen. Seen in a way she hadn't even realized she'd been waiting for. In the months that followed, small, quiet changes began reshaping the Bennett family in ways none of them could have predicted 6 weeks earlier. Susan began attending Sunday dinners again, tentative at first, arriving a little late to the first one, unsure of her welcome, then steadily more present, the distance between her and Peggy narrowing a little more with every visit. She began quietly, using part of her trust for the counseling sessions Nell had intended, sessions that helped her finally speak openly about the argument that had cost her 6 years with her mother, an argument she now understood had never needed to end their relationship at all. Richard, confronted directly with his mother's letter and the quiet shame of how quickly he had reached for suspicion, began pushing back gently against Diane's ongoing comments about the estate, a small but genuine shift in a marriage that had long revolved around exactly that kind of pressure, and for the first time in years he started calling Peggy just to talk, with no particular reason at all. Tommy opened the doors of his small restoration shop that spring, a modest storefront with a single black and white photograph of his grandmother placed quietly above the register, where every customer who ever asked about it got the same simple answer. She's the reason this place exists. On opening day, the whole family showed up together, Peggy, Richard, Susan, even Diane standing quietly toward the back, watching Tommy cut the ribbon across the front door with a pair of scissors that had once belonged to Nell herself. It was the first time in longer than any of them could remember that all 3 Bennett siblings had stood together in the same room without a single trace of old tension between them. Rosa was there too, on opening day, standing near the back of the small crowd with tears in her eyes, holding on to the memory of 30 years of porch conversations and monthly envelopes she had never fully understood until now. She approached Tommy quietly after the ribbon had been cut, pressing something small into his hand, a photograph she'd kept of Nell from years earlier, laughing on that same porch on some ordinary summer evening long before any of this began. She'd be proud of you, Rosa told him. Not because of the shop, because of who you already were before any of this happened. It was in many ways the truest thing anyone said that entire spring, a reminder that the money had only ever confirmed what the family already should have known about each other, rather than created it from nothing. Eleanor Bennett hadn't been poor for even a single day of her adult life. She had been patient, carrying a fortune quietly for 30 years, waiting not for the right financial moment, but for the right emotional one, waiting to see who her children would become to one another long before she ever let them know what she truly had. In the end, the money mattered far less than what it revealed, a family finally willing to see each other clearly, decades later than any of them would have liked, but not too late to matter. The brown wool coat still hangs in a closet on Larkspur Lane in the house Peggy now calls her own, kept not because anyone needs it, but because none of them, not even now, can quite bring themselves to let it go. Would you have handled it the way Nell did, or was her 30 years of silence its own kind of unfair? Let us know what you would have done in her position, and whether you think a secret like this one can ever truly be forgiven, even when it comes from love. If this story moved you the way it moved us to put it together, tell us in the comments below. Would you have kept a secret like Nell's, or would you have told your children the truth the moment you had it to tell? Every family carries its own quiet history, its own version of a shoebox tucked away somewhere, waiting for the right moment to be opened, and we'd genuinely love to hear yours, whatever it might be. And if you thought this story was hard to look away from, wait until you hear the one we're bringing you next, about a sister who discovered her brother, long believed gone, had actually been living just 2 towns over for 20 years, close enough to see, yet somehow never seen at all. A story that asks just how well any of us truly know the people we love most. Before we dive deeper into stories like this one, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.